This is Audible Bleeding, the Vascular Surgery Podcast. We're here to help you keep your finger on the pulse. Welcome back to Audible Bleeding. I'm Adam Johnson. Nicole Rich and I are here to bring you the first in a series of episodes produced in collaboration with the Society for Vascular Surgery Young Surgeons Advisory Committee, focused on topics relevant to the early career vascular surgeon. The Young Surgeons Committee is comprised of surgeons in their first 10 years of practice from both the academic and private practice setting. We'll discuss topics ranging from setting up a research lab, establishing a busy clinical practice, pitfalls to avoid in your first years of practice, and any advice from senior surgeons. We will include contact information for the committee in our show notes if you have any interest in becoming more involved in this committee or learning more about it. Our first episode today will focus on establishing a research lab and setting the groundwork for a productive academic career. We have with us two members of the Young Surgeons Advisory Committee, Dr. Mohamed Zayed and Dr. Nicholas Osborne. Dr. Mohamed Zayed has been an assistant professor of surgery at Washington University in St. Louis since 2014. He received his medical degree and PhD in pharmacology from UNC and vascular surgery residency training from Stanford. He has received many research awards for his translational research, including the Vascular Cures Wylie Scholar, American Surgical Association Foundation Fellow, and in 2016 was awarded a K-08 Career Development Grant from the NIH National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. Dr. Nicholas Osborne has been an assistant professor of vascular surgery at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan since 2014. He received his medical degree from Dartmouth and general surgery residency and vascular surgery fellowship at the University of Michigan. He has received multiple awards as well for his health services research from the American Heart Association, multiple industry groups, and has submitted a grant through the NIH Department for Health and Human Services. So welcome to our podcast, Dr. Zayed and Dr. Osborne.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for both of you being here today. We're just going to start off the discussion with a question for you, Dr. Osborne, about how you manage and protect your research time.
I think it's a question that I think we're going to ask ourselves as academic surgeons for the rest of our lives. And it starts out really all the way back in setting up your first job and negotiating your contract and figuring out how to negotiate your time that you want protected. And it all really depends upon what your goals are. And so as an academic surgeon, I think if you're truly committed to the idea of being an academic researcher and a clinical surgeon, or being mostly an academic researcher, I think either one of those, you need to be very careful about how you negotiate your contract to start, with keeping in mind that grants a lot of times will have very specific requirements for your protected time. So in first case, when you start thinking about negotiating your contract and you're going to be looking for jobs, a lot of people who are probably listening are in that process right now or finalizing their jobs as we speak. When you look at that first contract, I think it's really important that you realize the areas you can negotiate and the areas you can't really negotiate in a contract with an academic medical center. Since most academic medical centers really have pretty set salaries, one of the few areas you can actually negotiate is around research, and it's around protected time, and it's around funding that you have for startup. And I think those are two really key important areas for really negotiating and really playing a little bit of hardball to begin with to make sure you get what you need and being set up for success. I think in a minimum, when you start thinking about protected time, if you are going to be submitting grants to either societies or the NIH or American Heart Association or Wylie, wherever they might be, you need to, at least on paper, have negotiated a 50-50 contract of clinical and academic time. Now, that doesn't mean 50-50 in a 40-hour work week. Obviously, we all work more than that. But, in terms of looking on paper, you want to try and negotiate as much as possible toward having a couple protected days a week, or, you can space them out into the month block if you don't like working in a week block. But I think it's important to get that 50-50 time on paper to start with, just so you have that in writing. That's really important when you start submitting your grants. And then when you start getting grants, whether they're NIH grants or AHRQ grants, a lot of times those will those will actually require that you're 75% protected. And so you'll likely have to drop some clinical effort at that point to be able to keep those grants. If you get an American Heart Association grant or a Wylie Scholars grant, they have a requirement for 50% protected, which is going to be in line with what you've negotiated on your contracts. Then a lot of smaller ones will not necessarily have the same requirement for protected time, but they will give preference to people who have a commitment to protected time. And so on paper, it really is important that you get that 50-50 split.
So Dr. Osborne, when you're negotiating for this protected time, it kind of seems like a chicken and the egg with grants, that you can probably negotiate for more if you have a history of getting grants, but it's hard to get the grants if you don't have the protected time. So if you've maybe never had grant support, is it difficult to negotiate for this protected time?
Yeah, so I think it depends on your set point, where you're coming from and where you want to be. So if you're someone who has a history of having had, maybe you've been on a T-32 training grant or you've had an F-32 training grant, you have a history and a track record that makes you a little bit more desirable, I guess is a word for it, from some of the funding organizations. But I think in that case, you probably have a little bit more of a case to negotiate for a 50-50 split, because you probably will be able to make a case that you're going to be applying for NIH or other government funding, whether it's NIH or DOD or AHRQ. But if there's someone that's come out and you haven't had any funding in training or haven't been on a training grant, and you've had a modest publication history, but you really want to double down on health services research, let's say, or even partner in basic sciences. I think that either way, I think you need to aim for that 50% to begin with. Now, you may go somewhere where that's not necessarily possible or feasible, and you may be able to negotiate for 25% protected time to start. You can also put contingencies in things where you can negotiate for 25% protected time with the caveat that if you receive, this grant or, these types of grants, that you get 50% protected at that point, or more, depending on what the grants are. And I think that's something that you can negotiate in there. It's not necessarily a static number once you start, but I think you can negotiate some of those contingencies in there. And the same goes for your funding, because a lot of this will require startup to be able to generate the research, to generate the preliminary data, to write your grant. And I think the similar thing kind of happens where, there's some people who are going to be set up to negotiate immediately for a large startup package. And then there are other people who I think have to show or really demonstrate that they have the ability, because they may not have had that same opportunity in residency or fellowship to be able to do that. And so I think those people can build in some contingencies for, if you meet these milestones, you get more money as you move along. And I think that's another kind of way to approach it. Mohamed might have some other ideas on this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I mean, I think that one of the key things that Nick is pointing out is that really it's a method of time management. You have to know what your expectations are for yourself and what your expectations are from your university, department, and chairman. And some of that could be done initially with negotiation of your contract and defining your job. But also, it really depends on who you are and what your long-term, intermediate goal and short-term goals are. If your long-term goals are going to be to generate, a lot of revenue for the department with surgery, that's going to look different than if your long-term goal is going to be to establish an academic program with multiple facets of different types of research. In order to be able to do that successfully, you have to be able to manage your time successfully, and you have to position yourself in a way where you're able to manage your time successfully. So the other things to consider is, how do you structure your week and day-to-day activities to be able to accomplish your goals? And, one way to do this is to be fairly regimented in terms of what days you protect as your research days and what days you make yourself fully available to be able to do your clinical responsibilities. And so defining that early on and being able to stick with that schedule as best as possible and being fairly regimented, but also acknowledging that the nature of our job as physicians and clinicians and surgeons also requires some flexibility. But I think that that's an important variable to consider, is how well you're going to be able to manage your time, especially if you're going to be trying to do multiple tasks, like, for example, running a lab and being able to do surgery.
So I think some of the time management is so important. Would one of you be able to kind of go through your week? Like, what does your week look like? How do you split your time in order to be able to maintain a clinical practice and academics as well?
I guess I can give a stab at that. My weeks are kind of strange because I work in multiple hospitals. I'm the chief of vascular at the VA in Ann Arbor, and then also work at the university, and then have my research lab as well. And so I kind of, the way I've approached it is that days of the week don't necessarily work very well for me, because the way we've structured our VA practice is that we have week blocks where we cover in a group practice model. And so basically what I've done is I've tried to protect a week of the month, at least 1 to 1.5 weeks a month that I work in the lab. And then the rest of the time I have some unscheduled time at the university that I don't book cases into. And then there's some time that I do book cases at the university as well, to try and keep it at 50-50. Now, you always have some creep of clinical activity into your unscheduled time if you're not careful. And I think that's what Mohamed is getting at with the idea of really trying to keep specific days. I've made it work because I have good partners, and we have a group practice model where we take care of each other. And if I have a grant deadline or a paper deadline that's coming up, I've been able to ask for one of my partners to help and cover cases, especially at the VA when that's the case. We do that for each other on a regular basis. And that's something I think that works for us. But I'd say that in general, I'd agree with Mohamed that a day, scheduling specific days of the week is the best thing you can do. The other thing I think you really have to do is, as he said, be very regimented about it and actually write it down in your calendar. Don't just say, I'm going to work on these days. Like, block them out in your calendar, make them red so that you can't have anyone book into them, and try and really make it very hard to cut away those days from yourself, because it's very easy to start saying, oh, well, I can do the one case that day, I can add on another case that day, and then all of a sudden you've lost your whole day. And I think that's a really easy trap to fall into. So I'd say use your calendar as your best friend, and it manages your life as you get more and more busy. And I think that's one thing that I've learned over the last, 4.5 years, is that you really do have to be explicit about how you manage that time and be real to yourself about it.
It sounds like a lot of it comes down to really setting expectations for yourself and for the people that you're working with.
I guess we'll transition into our next topic. This is for Dr. Zayed. So, you are doing more work with basic science and managing a lab that you had mentioned earlier. Could you describe some of the tips and tricks for how to recruit lab members and keep your lab running effectively?
So in terms of figuring out your staffing needs, once you establish your lab, that's going to be a critical phase of development in terms of your research program, your ability to be able to be productive and being able to, reach the goals that you're setting out for yourself. And so early on, you should try to have an idea of how to staff the needs that you are going to need for your projects. And so as Nick will be able to elaborate on his projects, his staffing needs are probably different than my staffing needs as a basic scientist. And so early on, when I had to structure my lab, I basically wrote out the job descriptions of who I needed in the lab and what kind of tasks would I need them to be able to do, or what kind of skill set would they have to have, and what kind of time commitment I would need. And that helped define for me whether or not I would approach my staffing needs by hiring a technician versus a more experienced postdoctoral fellow, versus recruiting students at various different levels of training, like graduate students, medical students, residents, or even undergraduate students. And understanding what these different categories of potential staff for your lab understanding what their needs are is critical, because that helps you also frame what is going to be appealing about the job and what is going to be the critical needs that you need to have accomplished by each of these categories of staff. Once you've identified that and figured out what exactly are your staffing needs, and you've written out the job description, it's important to then get the word out. So communicating with your human resources department, job distribution listservs, both locally at your university, but also perhaps even in the region or nationally, is going to be important to be able to widen your capacity to be able to get the best possible candidates. And then promote your offer, promote what is special about it, what is going to be the unique thing about this job, what is the unique science that they're going to be engaged in, and what is the interaction going to be like within your lab, your section, division, department, even at your university. So being able to promote that job and making it appear appealing for applicants is going to be critical, again, to be able to attract the best possible candidates. It's important to also meet regularly and be able to assess progress and assess productivity and problem solve. And depending on what category of staff member, it's going to be important for you to understand whether or not it's going to be important to micro versus macro manage this individual. Certainly a postdoctoral fellow will need to have some additional independence, whereas a student is going to require a lot of mentorship and assistance. So understanding these frameworks is very important early on as well. If you want to incentivize your lab members, it's important to consider how they would be promoted and how they would be financially compensated for their work. And it's important to reward good employees. On the other hand, if a certain staff member is also not performing as expected, it's important to structure a way to be able to improve their performance and allow them opportunities to be able to discuss with you how to improve. In certain situations, it's important to understand how to allow staff to leave. And this has to be done in a very fair, equitable fashion, and there shouldn't be any surprises again if there's regular meetings and regular setting of expectations. One thing to acknowledge, and maybe Nick can discuss this as well, is early on while you were negotiating a contract, and Nick had mentioned this in the prior question, is negotiating for funds to be able to hire a lab member. That initial lab member is so key. And oftentimes people will, reflect and say, yes, that lab member, that first lab person was either a maker or breaker of a lab. And so it's important to acknowledge that that first staff member that you hire to the lab, how do you do that? How do you have the funds to do that? Oftentimes you're going to be cash strapped at that point, and you're probably working with startup funds, and the startup funds are limited. And so understanding that there are mechanisms potentially for negotiating for assistance early on to be able to at least fund part of the salary of a staff member in the lab would be highly, highly recommended. So maybe Nick can elaborate on that as well.
There are a lot of similarities and differences when you think about basic science labs and health services research. I think that there are obviously a lot of needs that go into starting up a basic science lab that aren't necessarily the same in health services research. But similarly, we a lot of times are looking at how to secure funding to hire a research analyst or a program manager or someone to help you get the research done. One thing I do think you have to be careful about is if you're invited early on to share a analyst, being very clear about expectations of how that person's time is going to be shared with you, because there's always someone who, unfortunately, one person's always going to get a little bit more out of the employee than the other, at least in my experience. And I think you have to be very clear about your expectations. Similar to that, I think sometimes I personally have been asked before to pick up a research analyst who I had funding to be able to support, and I needed a research analyst. And you have to ask the question of why is that analyst not being kept along in the lab that they were in? And being very careful about making sure you vet that person so that you are setting yourself up for success and not necessarily for failure. I think people have trouble letting people go, and sometimes it's easier to help them find another job, whether or not they're going to be completely successful in that job or not. That's not their problem once they get them a job. And so I think you have to be careful in those circumstances, because there are instances where you're going to be asked to either take someone's time or to support someone, and you just have to be clear about what you're going to get out of it, because this is obviously your money. It's your success that's really going to be judged in the end.
Thanks. Those are really great insights about how to put a good research team together. I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts or experience that you could share with how to keep a research team motivated and productive, and logistically, how do you structure your lab meetings when people may be working on different projects?
So I decided early on to hire a technician, and part of that, part of the reason I did that is because I wanted to be fairly hands-on early on in the development of the science. I felt that the early science was going to be an important foundation for all subsequent studies that we were going to do, and so I needed to be fairly involved in the lab and in the actual projects and experiments that we were conducting on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. As things progressed, and we were fortunate to have grant funding of several of our projects, I was then able to expand the staffing of our lab. And at that point, I felt that it was appropriate to hire a postdoctoral fellow, someone with much more experience and capacity to be able to conduct studies independently, and really kind of be integrally involved in the science and brainstorming of potential projects, hypotheses, and how to approach them. And that also was extremely valuable because this person was able to really contribute a lot to the lab's productivity and accelerate the science and move it forward. Along the way, I've also really had the fortune of being able to mentor residents as well as medical students and undergraduate students. And one thing to acknowledge is that it is a time investment to mentor young scientists who are seeking to have additional experience so that it could potentially help them decide whether or not to pursue an academic career as a physician scientist. And it's a valuable experience for me as well as for them. For me, I learned a lot from being able to mentor individuals. Oftentimes, they'll challenge you and ask you inquisitive questions that will make you think once again of why you're studying certain things and how to better explain them and decide on how to approach them. But it's important to acknowledge the time commitment and how much you can and cannot do. And so I've had to set certain limits for myself on how many students or trainees to include in the projects. And also it's important to acknowledge also that the amount of time that you invest in it may sometimes not be entirely equitable with the science that you get out of it. So just having these realistic expectations early on is important so that the core mission of the lab is moving forward, and at the same time, your staffing needs are fulfilled.
Well, that's a great transition into our next topic regarding establishing a good mentor-mentee relationship. Dr. Osborne, do you have any thoughts on that, or can you comment on kind of how to set expectations when you have a mentee?
I've had the benefit of having a good relationship with someone for quite a long time, and Dr. Justin Dimmick and I have had a collaborative and mentoring relationship for over 10 years now. And so I've had the benefit of that. I can tell you, jokingly, I like to say that I can tell you how to be a bad mentee more than a good mentee, probably. But the idea really, I think, is how do you number one, identify someone who's going to be a good mentor. Number two, how do you then structure that relationship that it is a healthy and productive relationship. And that's a two-way street. And I think it's important to recognize that it's a two-way street and that each person has to put in just as much to make it successful. Once you get the mentor established and you know who it's going to be, then I think there are very clear expectations on both people's sides to make it a successful relationship. And the first of that is really time and figuring out how to guarantee that you're going to get the appropriate amount of mentorship time from your mentor, but are you going to be able to devote the appropriate amount of time as the mentee? Number two, I think it's important that you think about what the goals are, and you really have to almost set out a contract with that mentor ahead of time where you kind of set out what your short-term and long-term goals are, what your expectations for meeting are, and those should be frequent meetings when you're getting ready and starting your career until you get your first grant funding. I think that really has to be frequent. You have to have meetings at least every month to get going, and when you're in your grant writing phase, it could be even weekly meetings to really get your grant into the shape that it needs to be to get funded. But I think it's important to set those expectations from the beginning, and I don't think that it's unreasonable to consider a contract with your mentor to really set that in stone. It keeps you honest, it keeps them honest, and I think that's a good structure to start from, and then you can always modify it and work on it from there. The other thing I think that a mentor does for you is they can open doors for you where you wouldn't necessarily have them open before. So opportunities for writing, whether it's invited commentaries or for reviewing for journals, whether they suggest you for invited talks in different areas. I think those are all things that a good mentor does, and they really promote you as opposed to promoting themselves. And so you got to find someone at the right stage in their career to do that. And I think it's definitely not an easy thing to do, but I think it's critical that you find those traits in someone when you're looking for a mentor. And I think outlining what your expectations are, both the mentor's expectation, the mentee's expectation, is really important. Now, occasionally it just doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, I think you just have to figure out how to be honest about that. And that's where I think a contract really helps to help you get out of those situations where you're not in a good relationship. And I think that's important.
I agree with a lot of the points that Nick has made. The thing that I would add is that it's important to also not let go of your old mentors, and don't be confined to only a few new mentors. And what I mean by that is that your old mentors from prior research experiences or even clinical experiences are going to help you navigate your new mentor selection. Some of the mentors that you've had in the past may have certain qualities that you really admired and that you really felt helped promote and advance your career moving forward. And understanding these qualities helps you shape your new mentor selection and what kind of criteria you're using to be able to select these new mentors. Also, it's a very important connection to have for your future grant applications. Oftentimes, many of these career development grant applications require you to have multiple letters of recommendations. And especially when you're early on in your career, you won't have a large network of mentors already established, except obviously your older mentors from other institutions or different phases of your professional development. These are individuals that you can certainly go back to and seek advice and seek assistance from. In terms of seeking out your new mentors, as Nick mentioned, he has a very accomplished mentor within the Department of Surgery at his institution. It's also important to acknowledge that you can have mentors outside of your department. My primary mentor for my NHLBI grant is actually an endocrinologist. He's the chief of endocrinology at Washington University. And my research focuses on the complications of peripheral arterial disease in patients with diabetes. So it made sense for me to try to find a mentor who has expertise in diabetes and help me develop that expertise over time. And that's been an invaluable relationship and really something that has helped me progress my science in that field. Mentors can come in all shapes and sizes, as you can see, and their responsibilities and their and how you would be able to have them help you is going to be in different ways.
So I think this is a great transition into our last topic. It seems that what gives you the freedom to do the research that you want and to have the protected time is the money. Can you break down a little bit of how to approach grant funding, what some of the different options are, and where people can go as resources to find potential funding sources?
That's a great question, and it's a vital one, right? So in order to be able to do the science that we do, both on the health services and from Nick's point of view, as well as basic science work from my standpoint, really to be able to do that, you need funding, and you need sustained funding to be able to do it. And it's challenging. Let's just summarize it like that. There's nothing easy about being able to compete and acquire funding at a high level. And this is a ongoing process that we all continue to learn and get better at. And even with time, the funding becomes still a challenge. And so it's important to have a broad perspective on that and to be able to approach funding in a way that's diversified, and have kind of the insight that there are established ways for funding that are important to pursue, that sometimes actually academic institutions will base your promotion on. But it's also important to acknowledge that there are other funding streams that you can pursue that can progress your science and allow you to be able to achieve the important milestones that you've set out for yourself, your lab, and your staff members. So with that framework, it's important to just understand what are the funding processes. And I kind of put them into three categories. There's the formal federal funding processes through the National Institutes of Health. And these are the highest caliber and most competitive type of grants. And as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes academic institutions will use that as a benchmark for scientific success as well as academic promotion. The highest level of funding is R01 grants, and these are the most coveted and most competitive grants that are offered through the NIH. And usually these are for individuals who have already made significant headway with their science. For earlier stage investigators, there are career development opportunities, and these are the K award series, and there's different types of Ks. And the K awards intend to allow a early stage investigator to have dedicated research time that's, again, carved out within their schedule at the academic institution that they've selected for themselves. And it provides them really an opportunity to have a good stream of funding that could be between 3 to 5 years, and at the same time be able to accomplish scientific milestones and accomplish career development milestones. And the career development milestones are ones that are outlined by you and an advisory committee that you select to allow you to be able to develop expertise in the field that you are conducting research in. And I am currently a K awardee, and I find that this mechanism is a very, very helpful mechanism of funding for junior physician scientists, and primarily because of the career development opportunity and having the dedicated research time. I think the science in of itself is important, but that could be developed using funding from many different avenues. And so I think that the main advantage of the K is that it provides dedicated research time and the opportunities to have career development. The other funding streams that are important to acknowledge in the second category are foundation awards. And actually the first grant that I got when I first started at Washington University was a Society for Vascular Surgery Foundation Award. And that award was so immensely important to allow me to be able to, again, partially fund a staff member, the first technician that I hired, but it also allowed me to be able to test a specific hypothesis and be able to generate enough data to be able to publish a first manuscript. And so having that stepping stone was so important to be able to compete for other grants, because one of the criteria that grants utilize is how do you measure compared to other individuals who are also competing for the same grant. And one of these criteria is how productive have you been with other prior funding that you've had. And so having that initial award from the Society for Vascular Surgery was immensely helpful, and I'm grateful for that. And other foundation awards exist through the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, and various other foundations that promote research within specific research disciplines. And so seeking these out within the field of your interest will help you be able to compete for funding as well. That can be very valuable. The third is institutional type grants. And at Washington University, like other academic institutions, there are internal funding mechanisms through either core facilities or program project grants or research centers. And it's important to identify these and identify their criteria and to really compete for these types of funding opportunities, because they can provide you some essential startup funds to, again, test specific hypotheses and be able to develop your science locally. And again, these could be utilized to compete for the larger grants subsequently. So I've taken advantage of several of these grants at my home institution. And again, they were very valuable in being able to generate specific data sets that have been valuable for then subsequent larger grants. But understanding that their grants come in different types is important, and being able to diversify your funding is important. And as a new faculty or a junior faculty, trying to compete for these different categories is important. Now, while you're doing that, it's also very important to balance your time and not spend all your time just writing grants. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to also be productive with publishing your manuscripts and promoting your science. So there has to be a certain limit to what you are going to be applying for. You can't apply for everything, and I think it would be almost a waste of time to do that. So you have to be fairly strategic about the types of grants that you pursue, so that your time, which is the most valuable part of all this, is spent wisely. And then in the end, just understand that the funding climate continues to be difficult, and it's a competitive process. So even if you write a great grant and your hypotheses are really nicely generated and they're substantiated and you're really excited about them and the grant still doesn't get funded, it's important to acknowledge that there's many types of grants like that that other people have written, and not to be discouraged. So one of the key things that my mentors have imparted on me is to, continue the process and not to give up when a grant obviously doesn't get funded from the first or second or even the third time. These are important opportunities to be able to develop the science better. Oftentimes you'll get reviews that will give you critiques to enhance the type of proposals that you're submitting, and utilizing that feedback constructively is an opportunity. And it's important to view these feedback as a way to be able to both self-improve yourself as well as your science. I know that Nick has a different type of funding mechanism, and he can elaborate on how he approached his funding for his type of research as well.
I think the first thing I'd say is get used to disappointment. It's just, I think it's the hit rate for grants is not super high. So personally, I've submitted probably about 12 grants, and I've gotten 2 major grants, or 1 major grant and 1 that's pending and should be funded based on the funding lines. But I think you got to get used to the fact that it's a competitive field, and we don't like being told that we're not good at something or that we get negative feedback. But you have to grow from it, and I think it's the nature of the game. So writing grants, just get ready for getting a lot of feedback that isn't necessarily what you'd like to hear, which is that it's not funded, but grow from it and learn from it. Personally, I've done that a lot, and I think every grant that I've written has been better based on the feedback I've gotten from previous failed grants. And so my grants, if you look at them now compared to 5 years ago, are very different in terms of the approach, the way they're written, and just the way that they've really been sold. I think is really very different from what they started from. I think that's the importance of the whole mechanism, and it does work, but you have to get used to the idea of failure. That's not something that surgeons really like. Now, when you think about it, I think Mohamed's right. You kind of think about it in the different buckets of funding, and I think if you think about starting out, when you're negotiating your contract, you're going to negotiate for startup funds. Once you do that, I think you start out and you try and use as little of that as possible before you get some other funding, to try and squirrel that away is what most people do. And I think the first funding you should really look at is look in your institution for those low-hanging fruit, for the micro grants or the startup grants that you can get within your institution that might help you along and help, like in Mohamed's case, fund a research tech for a project that could then be used to write a much bigger grant and get funded on that bigger grant. I think that's the first step, is those institutional ones. And then the second one are the societal or the small sub-societal grants. And so vascular surgery is pretty, I think we're pretty lucky that we have a lot of society grant funding available, whether it's through the SVS, like the Wylie Scholars Award or the SVS Foundation Awards, or whether it's the VESS, which has their own Young Investigator Award, or the American Venous Forum has one. There are a lot of different opportunities out there just within vascular surgery. And then if you look within the cardiovascular space, there's even more. And so you have a lot of grant funding mechanisms through the American Heart Association, which is where I got my first grant from. And so I think you have a lot of opportunity there to look. And then the last one is those major government or large grants, and that can be NIH, as Mohamed mentioned, or AHRQ if it's health services research, or even DoD funding if it's really translational research or something that's more aimed at that. And those are all very good avenues for research in the future. But I would start out with the smaller grants and move on in kind of stepping stone fashion from there through that timeline. And I think you just have to be used to the idea of that this is an iterative process. It's going to take time, and your first grant's not going to be your best grant. It typically is going to be one of your worst grants, and you're going to need to grow from it and get better every single grant you do. And it's okay to give up on an idea if you find something better. And I think that's really important. And I pursued funding through the VA for the first 2 years. I was trying to get funded through the Career Development Award mechanism in the VA. And after a couple of really unsuccessful attempts at that, I restructured my grant and really changed it based on some feedback, but then also kind of repackaged it and submitted it for American Heart Association and was able to get a Career Development Award from them. And since then, I've now sent another grant in for funding from the NIH that scored very competitively, which I'm hoping to get funded here this next cycle. So I think it just goes to that it's a long process, and for me, it's been 5 years to get that first NIH grant funding. Some people that's within 1 or 2 years, but it's okay if it takes a little bit longer. It doesn't mean that you're a failure. It's important to remember that this is a lot of why we went into academic surgery, and so you have to, if you don't like this part of it, then you have to really kind of rethink what your reason or rationale for what you're doing is. But I think it's really easy to get down on yourself during this time when you're getting grants that are negatively scored or you get a lot of negative feedback on them. But it's an opportunity to kind of step back, think about it objectively, really critically look at the feedback, and then make it stronger and make it better.
Dr. Osborne, can you speak a little bit about the timeline for getting these types of funding and whether you started that process as a fellow or whether this was something that you started once you had your first academic job as an attending?
Yeah, so I started thinking about my project when I was a fellow. I didn't submit any grants as a fellow. I know some people who have started by submitting small grants as a fellow, but I don't think that's necessarily critical. I think it's really critical that you get a good contract, you find a good place that you're going to be working, and really focus on those parts of it first, and then second, get your funding after that.
The timeline, for everyone is going to be a little bit different. And it kind of really depends on, the science that you're trying and how much do you have to learn, to be able to generate that initial data set that you feel confident in and that you can establish some novel hypotheses on. So that timeline can vary plus or minus a couple of years for different people. There are, people that will stay at their training institution. So if you're a fellow and you're going to be staying at the same institution for your first job, either as an instructor level or an assistant professor, that actually gives you an opportunity to consider submitting your grant early. What you should consider, though, in that process is that oftentimes career development awards will require dedicated research time, and that requires a written approval from your department chairman, and obviously it has to be reflected in your employment contract. There are individuals that can start early on this if they so choose. But it's important, as Nick mentioned, not to necessarily rush it. It will save you a lot of anguish if you submit a good grant rather than one that's rushed. And from a strategic standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to strategize your time. Do you want to spend your time writing grants that are not going to necessarily have a good funding rate, or do you want to have an academic portfolio with evidence of productivity via publications or national presentations, etc.? So it's important to kind of be realistic early on how you want to manage your time and where you want to put it. And so my suggestion is actually very similar to what Nick has stated, is that, probably your first couple of years as early faculty, you should really try to identify institutional funding, foundation funding, society funding, and then develop your hypotheses that way, develop your network of mentors, and then at that point try to compete for either a career development award or a larger federally funded award.
Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. We want to thank you for your time. Do you guys have any closing advice for young surgeons interested in an academic career?
As someone who's gone through it recently, I think it's important to recognize your resources that are available. And I think, the Young Surgeons Committee is one example of resources that are available at the society level. But there are a lot of great resources out there within vascular surgery. We have the benefit of being a very small specialty in surgery, and everyone really knows each other pretty well. And I think if you ever reached out to any of us, I think we'd be happy to give our input, our mentorship at an individual level as well. And so I'd invite people to just contact any of us with questions or any kind of advice seeking that they have, because it's a small group and we're happy and we want to make sure everyone succeeds at what they do.
There are other online and fairly easy to access resources also, and I just wanted to provide you with them. So the Howard Hughes Medical Institute has an online publication, fully downloadable book. The title of it is Making the Right Moves, a practical guide to scientific management for postdocs, new faculty. And that's a fully downloadable book, has incredible resources there for early stage investigators. There's also a book that was authored by Dr. Melina Kibbe, who is an academic vascular surgery, the chair of surgery at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The title of the book is Success in Academic Surgery. And that one focuses mostly on basic science, but there is a sister publication that's Success in Academic Surgery and Clinical Sciences as well. And then the Academic Surgical Association has an annual academic surgical congress. And on a yearly basis, there's a investigators course that's offered usually early February. And it provides early stage investigators who are surgeons advice on how to be able to develop their research and academic programs. So, and there's many more, but these are ones that I've utilized, and I wanted to share them with you, and perhaps the listeners will also find benefit from them.
Well, great. We'll include links to those in our show notes for further reading. And we want to, again, thank you for your time, and have a great day.
Thank you.
We are Audible Bleeding, the vascular surgery podcast. You can find us on social media at Audible Bleeding or online at audiblebleeding.com.